I've had a couple of things come across my desk. When I say my desk, literally my laptop lately. It's not anything that we haven't looked at before, but there are things that we need to be reminded of. And one was the matter, and by the way, this question came out of the article that came across my desk that prompted this morning's sermon, to write that sermon this morning, last night and this morning. And there were some things in that article about taking the Lord's name in vain. And the whole time I was growing up, I was taught that to use the name of God to say such as, oh my God, or something, some exclamatory statement to that effect was a violation of what the Bible says, to take God's name in vain. And in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, it says, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." That's Exodus 20 and verse number 7. Now, I'm not defending the practice of saying such things as I've just illustrated, but that is not the meaning of that text. To take the name of the Lord means to invoke the name of the Lord. And so when it says God will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain, it means to invoke the name of the Lord, but to do so in a way, or to not fulfill one's vows in invoking the name of the Lord. For example, look in 1 Samuel chapter 24 real quick. I'm going to show you just a couple things. Because what we have to do is we have to understand the context of what's being understood, what's being taught here. And that the Jews bound themselves with vows and bound themselves under oaths. Okay? And oftentimes those vows or oaths would invoke the name of God. And if a person invoked the name of God and then didn't keep their vow, then that was what was under consideration. And so, for example, in 1 Samuel chapter 24 and in verse number 21, you see here David. This is one of the incidents between David and Saul, where David spares Saul's life, and it says Saul says, "And now I know indeed that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house." So David swore to Saul. Now, you see the language there, right? Swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants. The practice of pagan kings in those days, godless kings in those days, is that when a king, and many times kings began to rule by subterfuge rather than inheritance. And if a king presumed the throne and he deposed another king, one thing that he would do is he'd kill all that dude's descendants. In other words, I don't want anybody coming back later and trying to get me for taking their daddy's throne. And so, of course, Saul, being minded the way that he was, not very spiritually minded, thought that David might do that very same thing to him, despite the fact that David didn't kill him in that very instance. But the point was that Saul said to David, "Swear to me by the Lord that you will not do this." And David, and the Bible says, and David swore to Saul there in verse 22. And there are other examples. I've got one written down here in Jeremiah chapter 12. Jeremiah chapter 12 and in verse number 16, it says, and this is the Lord speaking to Jeremiah. He says, "And it shall be, if they will learn carefully the ways of my people, and swear by my name, as the Lord lives, as they taught my people to swear by Baal, then they shall be established in the midst of my people. And so you see, the Lord is here giving instruction that the instruction is, my people have been swearing by Baal, but they need to be instructed to swear by my name rather than the name of Baal. And so that swearing, that putting oneself under compulsion or obligation through the name of the Lord is what is under discussion here, and not simply the flippant use of God's name as we've commonly been taught it. Again, I'm not saying that it's okay to do that. I mean, there are about 20 different sins of the tongue enumerated in Scriptures. And one of them is that we will give an account for our idle words, or by our words we'll be justified, and by our words we'll be condemned. And so I'm not saying we should or can say those things. I'm simply saying Exodus 20 and verse 7 is not the verse that forbids it. It's talking about something completely different. And so also you have the idea of profaning the name of the Lord. And I think that's what's under consideration in the illustration that I gave you. To profane a thing. Now again, we have to understand what profane means. To profane a thing, speaking in biblical terminology, because that's where we find the word profane. To profane a thing is to take a thing that God has set apart and treat it as if it is common. In other words, it's to take a holy thing and turn it into an earthly thing. And so I think when people take the name of God, which should be held in reverence, it should be held in honor, should be held in the highest regard. And by the way, the word God is not His name. It's just the English rendering. It's just the English rendering that we have for a name that nobody even knows how to spell. It's called the Tetragrammaton. You know, there were at least 6 letters in the name of God in the Old Testament, and out of respect for God's name, the Jews and the scribes would not even say that name, and they dropped the vowels out of it. And so now all we have in regard to the name of God is this. Let's see. Be YHWH. That's 4 letters. The Tetragrammaton. Now, what people normally think is that the name, if we were going to write it out, would be Yahweh. Yahweh. And a lot of times you'll see Yahweh in writing and in literature and whatnot, but there's no absolute certainty that that's what it is. But that's it says this is the name of God. That's more of a reflection of what He is rather than who He is. Does that make sense? He is God, but His name is not God. In other words, when God spoke to Moses and said, "You're going to know me by my name," that's not the name that He got. All right. So there are things about God and His name that need to be properly understood. But I think to use that name in a flippant way, or to use the designation of God in a flippant way, would be to take a thing that's holy and profane it, treat it as if it was a common thing. Now we have this also in principle in Hebrews 10 and verse 26 and following, when it speaks about those who sin willfully after they've received the knowledge of the truth. There remains no more sacrifice for sins. And what does the Hebrew writer say? He says, he counts the blood of Christ, depending on your translation, as a common or a profane thing. And in the Old Testament, you read things such as, and I noted this in passing in one of the sins enumerated in Jeremiah, was they profaned the Sabbath. So what do you mean they profaned the Sabbath? Well, the Sabbath day was a holy day. It was a sanctified day. It was a set-apart day. What were you supposed to do on the Sabbath? Rest. You're supposed to rest. And so when people didn't rest and they treated that seventh day just like it was any other day of the week, and they worked on that day and did all types of common things on that day that God had told them not to do, they profaned it. In other words, they took a thing that God had set apart as holy, which simply means set apart and sanctified, and treated it as if it was not. And that's in that text in Jeremiah that I referenced this morning. He talked about don't work on the Sabbath like you're doing. That was one of the things that the Jews had done. They just treated Saturday, what we would call Saturday, the Sabbath, just like any other day. And so that's the idea of profane or profanity. So profanity in language would be using the language, Grandma would used to call it gutter talk. Gutter talk. Not even earthly, but even lower than the gutters, even down here below that. But again, that's technically not it. But to speak in profanities means to speak in worldly terms, using words that would mark an individual or identify them with worldly thinking, as opposed to one who is spiritually minded. And by the way, if you didn't have to go through this with your kids, you will probably, is that your kids get a certain age and they say, it's just words. You ever hear that, Johnny? It's just words. It's just a word. And I've heard people in public say that, guys like Russell Brand, or guys that they permit their children to, what we would say, they permit their children to curse. They permit their children to curse, and so that would be profanity. But it's taking that language, and that language identifies a person as being worldly and not as being spiritual. It's not insofar as what the word is; it's what the word represents, and how you are represented by using that word. That's what makes the word the problem. I never understood what the word bloody meant in England, but that was one of their words, right? And by the way, I still don't know what it means, and I don't know what the origin of it is, although I think I heard one time that it had something to do with the crucifixion, that there was some reason that the word bloody was associated profanely with the crucifixion. Now, maybe somebody's watching, or maybe somebody in here knows where that word came from and what, but you remember growing up, that was their word. By the way, you hardly ever hear that word anymore. It's gone. It's kind of gone into the dustbin of their language. I guess maybe some of the old people may still use it, but you see, it's just a word. We would never think. We don't think about that word, and yet over there it meant something. I got to tell y'all this one. If you ever go to Ghana, you better be ready. You better be ready, because Ghanaians speak English by and large, and they watch American television on the Ghanaian networks, and those shows are not edited. In other words, like used to, we could watch a TV show and not have to worry about hearing any bad language. Of course, those days are long gone as well. But man, Ghanaians will drop some curse words on you. But you know what? They don't mean anything to them, because they've heard these words used in American vernacular on TV, so they just think it's just a word that Americans use, and they'd be right. but they'll drop some profanities on you, and you just have to kind of bristle a little bit and just say, look, man, you can't say that in America. The funniest, this is not a profanity, but the funniest one I ever remember was we were at Edward and Maggie's house, and we had bought some ice cream, which is a luxury over there, eating ice cream. And we'd gone and bought some ice cream, and we're sitting in the kitchen eating ice cream. And Edward, he's a big old round guy, bald-headed, big old round head, and man, he's just as black as the ace of spades. He closes his eyes at night, you'll never see him. All right, and we're sitting in here and we're eating this ice cream, and Edward don't eat ice cream much, and he gets him about 3 big old bites in succession. And then the next thing you know, you see Edward sitting at the table doing this, hitting himself in the head. Of course, we all know what happened to him, right? Got brain freeze. But you know what his wife said? She goes, Edward, you look like a monkey. And Toby said, Maggie, you can't say that. Not in America, you can't say that. Didn't mean anything to her at all. So words, it's not always the words, it's what the words represent or what they associate us with when we use them. All right, so there's the idea of taking the Lord's name.
Yeah, because it's cool to blur the lines a little bit.
Oh, no, kids at junior high blur the lines of language?
Well, I didn't know what that meant.
This is my shocked face.
I didn't know that meant.
I didn't know what that meant, yeah.
That's not what I meant.
Yeah. I can hear it. I can hear it.
Or they use words that when I was growing up were really bad words, but to them it's everyday words.
Oh yeah,
Especially, oh my God.
Oh yeah,
I truly don't know not to say that.
Yeah, a lot of those kids have no idea about what we would say OMG. They don't understand. They don't understand OMG.
I've had to explain that many times over the years.
Yeah.
Why that's not good.
Right.
Why we don't say that.
And by the way, that's the one that really works on me. Of all the words that people say, it's still just people use, again, and I'm going to use the terminology that we all use, taking the Lord's name in vain. Still works on me. I just bristle every time I hear it. Because I was just, that's what I was taught. Don't say anything, and don't say anything that's even remotely akin to that. And so, but yeah, again, we've entered into a place in our society where kids hear these things and they're permissible at home. Listen, I remember we were at a basketball game last year, and I don't remember who we were playing. But there were about 4 boys, high school boys, sitting behind me and Jeff Goff. We sit at the table right there. He's the scorekeeper, and I'm on the microphone. And them boys, their language was just filthy, and they were shouting filthy words at players and referees. And Jeff Goff, man, he don't tolerate. None of us tolerate it, but Jeff will say something in a heartbeat. Most of the time I just try to ignore that foolishness. Jeff turned around in a heartbeat, and here's what he said. He said, does your mother let you talk like that at home? And that kid said, yep. And I believe him.
Or just being smart of it. That's the way ours are.
Yeah, but
they say yes.
But those kids, they just, they wasn't raised like I was raised. Never had their teeth brushed with soap. That's true too. All right, let's get to the next question. This one came across from a friend that I have met online. She is a member of the church in Kenya, and every week she kind of reports into me. I don't know why, but she tells me what she's been teaching in her ladies' class and what she's been teaching in the children's class. And last week she said there was a huge discussion in the class about miracles. That there were some people in the class that said, miracles don't happen today, and a bunch of people in the class said miracles do happen today. And it was the way she presented it was a pretty big source of contention how that thing kind of played out. And one thing that we always need to be aware of is how we define words. How do we define words? Because if something crazy happens in a ball game, we say it's a miracle. It was a miracle. Just some crazy. It was a miracle. Or Walter's favorite reference was the miracle of birth. That was the one Walter always took, the miracle of birth. Or somebody had a car wreck and the car was absolutely destroyed, and whoever was inside of it walked away. And this is a miracle. All right, and so none of those things are miracles. Not in the Bible sense of the word miracle. All right. When we talk about miracles, we need to speak as the Bible speaks about those things. And in the Bible, a miracle is where there is an undeniable intervention by God that suspends natural law in such a way as there is no physical explanation for it, other than the fact that God has intervened. I've told y'all in time past, and I've got this. I think it's in Popular Mechanics. I think it's in my old office back here. That Popular Mechanics tried to explain the burning bush one time, and their explanation is that there's so much oil and gas in the Middle East that there was a natural gas seepage coming up out of the ground, and it got struck by lightning, and it set it on fire, and it was behind the bush, but Moses thought that the bush was on fire but not being burned up. I mean, that's an attempt at a physical explanation for a miraculous event that he just didn't understand what he was really seeing. But in other senses, when we talk about miracles, we start talking about things such as the dead being raised. People who have withered hands being restored. People who have never walked immediately, taking up their bed and not just walking but running. Despite the fact they've never walked, you have to learn to walk. Even if you're an adult and you suffer some injury, a lot of times you have to learn to walk again. Because your muscles are atrophied. That's right. And you have to learn the process. And so there are a lot of things in the Bible where there's no explanation other than the fact that God stepped in and did something that cannot be explained by natural means. Again, somebody being raised from the dead, withered hand. Leprosy instantly cured. The woman with the issue of blood. Take your pick. Those are miracles. Those are miracles. And so, and did I tell you the lady's name in Kenya? Her name's Josephine. And I need to talk to Josephine and make sure that because I've already responded, but I need to mention to her that you need to understand the terminology. Because when you start dealing with people, especially in other places around the world, they will embrace things that are miracles, even though they'll tell you that miracles don't happen. I'll give you an explanation. What I mean by that is, all my guys in Ghana will teach exactly what I teach about miracles. All the guys in the school of preaching, all the students in the school of preaching, all the local guys I know will tell you miracles don't happen. But there is a bunch of them that still believe in witchcraft. I mean, like literal fairy tale witchcraft. Putting hexes on people and curses on people. There is a Ghanaian legend about and I can't remember which way this goes. It doesn't matter, but I'm gonna tell it both ways. Either there's a legend. By the way, a grass cutter is a rodent in Ghana that they eat. Okay, it's kind of like a cross. It's more along. It really looks more like a nutria rat. if you know what a nutria rat is. It's more of not than a long-tailed rat, although it does have a tail. All right? And by the way, it is delicious. Right? But there's a legend about, and I can't remember how this thing works, that under certain conditions, if you shoot a grass cutter, it'll turn into a man. Or they shot a man and he turned into a grass cutter. I think it shot a grass cutter and he turned into a man. And they believe that. They believe that. The same guys that would get up and preach the exact same thing that I'm telling you tonight about that there are no miracles today, believe in those witchcraft and legends. Like, if you drink water out of a mud puddle, it'll cure the hiccups. Now, we all know the thing is, we all know that people can drink water and solve the hiccups, but if you drink both, you can either drink mud puddle water or you can drink eddy water. That is still water that's in a river. If you can find it. What? Oh yeah, water upside down. But there are some reasonable explanations for drinking water for hiccups. What I'm saying is they believe in a lot of these things. And they don't realize that what they believe in is actually they believe in the supernatural. It's a supernatural event. And so, these things, again, we live in we live in a modern society. Okay, and most of us have enough sense to know what a miracle is and what it's not. But a lot of people around the world are not, and I hate to use the word enlightened because that indicates that those people are not intelligent, and they are highly intelligent. I mean, they speak multiple languages. I mean, these people are extremely intelligent, but they hold on to ideas that are in conflict with other ideas that they know that the Bible teaches. And so we want to define the terms of miracles and what is a miracle. And then just very quickly we would ask about who performed miracles in the days of the New Testament. We have the first person in the New Testament to perform a miracle was Jesus. John the Baptist never performed a miracle. Never did. Jesus was the first to perform miracles. And then Jesus empowered his disciples, the 12, to perform miracles. And then the 70 were given the power. In the limited commission, those men were empowered to perform miracles. And so they're, in that confined area, you're talking about close to 100 men that we know of specifically who could perform miracles. And by the way, the apostles didn't even know all of them, because there's an account where the apostles came to Jesus and said, "We saw a man casting out demons in your name, and we didn't know him, so we told him to stop." And Jesus is like, "Why'd you do that?" If a man, if the man can cast out demons, he's obviously one of us because of what he can do. But you had a very small number of people in that day and time that were given miracles. And then once the church was established, there were a number of people empowered to perform miracles. We have about 9 different miraculous gifts listed in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 that obviously the church at Corinth and members of that church and multiple members could perform. There were 9 miracles, but that doesn't mean only 9 people could perform miracles. There might have been 20 or 30 or 100 or whatever the number might be. But we have to say, well, who were these that were enabled to perform miracles? Beyond Jesus and the 12 and the 70, and the Bible answers that for us in Acts chapter 8, that those on whom the apostles laid their hands received the miraculous power and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And as Paul said, the Spirit gives the gifts to those whom He wills. And so, in our day and time, obviously Jesus is not here to confer those powers. And the apostles are not here to confer those powers. You have the 12 apostles, and you have the apostle Paul in Acts 19. He laid hands on the men at Ephesus, and they spoke in languages, tongues unknown, languages not previously known. But as best I can read in my Bible, when the last of those people died, the miracles died with them. Because we don't have any record of anybody just, I used this term this morning, willy-nilly being able to perform miracles. There was a process. The process was observable. Simon the sorcerer saw that through the laying on of the apostles' hands, the Holy Spirit was given. Philip was already in Samaria in Acts 8. He was already performing miracles. Why call for Peter and John to come down from Jerusalem to Samaria if the Holy Spirit could have just empowered people without them, or if Philip could have done it? But it says specifically they called for the apostles to come down from Jerusalem for that specific purpose. And Simon the sorcerer saw it. When he saw that through the laying on of the apostles' hands the Spirit was given, he offered them money and said, "Give me this power also, that on whom I lay my hands, they will receive the Holy Spirit." Of course, Peter said, "Your money perish with you. You need to go die and take your money with you. You thought the gift of God could be purchased with money." But again, there's the pattern that we're looking for on how the miraculous was given. The purpose of the calling of the apostles and the pattern for the passing on of those gifts. And then, and I'll close with this. We'll probably have to come back to some of this next week. Why were the gifts given? Well, nowadays they were given so you can drive around and fly around in a $20 million private jet. You can, as John and I observed, you can pass around an old slide credit card machine. John and I witnessed that. A guy claiming to perform miracles. Some of y'all not old enough to remember those. Used to, you had to put your credit card in a little box that had a carbon paper in it, and that thing rolled it over the top of your credit card, and all the numbers on your card came up, and then you signed that. Well, he had one of those, and that's what he said. It says we'll take cash or credit cards. So the purpose of the miraculous today seems to be to make some people rich. Yeah, Venmo. Just Venmo is PayPal-less, But you think about nobody in the New Testament ever used miracles to enrich themselves. I think that's an important thing to remember. What did Jesus say to those people that He enabled to perform miracles? He said, "Freely, what? Freely you have received, freely give." That's exactly right. When He sent them out, He didn't send them out with any means. With any means, the gift of the miraculous and no financial means, and they were not to make merchandise, of the preaching of the gospel. Paul had the ability to perform miracles, and yet he said on a number of occasions he was hungry. He went hungry. There were the basic necessities of life that avoided him at times. You know, he said, I know how to be full and I know how to be hungry. I know how to abound and I know how to suffer need or suffer want. And yet Paul had the ability to perform miracles. Yet he did not use it to enrich himself. And none of the apostles, and all the apostles, we could say the same of them. So, why were the gifts given? Ultimately, the gifts were given, primarily the gifts were given to confirm the message of the people that were preaching and performing the miracles. Or you could go somewhere and you're preaching a message and somebody says, why should I believe you? By the way, is that a legitimate argument? Sure is. Anybody can go anywhere and preach anything they want. The question is, do you have the proof to back up that what you are saying is true? And in the apostles' case, and in the case of the 70, they had the proof. They performed miracles. They cast out demons. They raised the dead. They healed the sick. They restored the maimed and gave the ability to walk to those that were paralyzed. And so they had the proof that their message was from God. And we see that, for example, in Mark 16 and verse 17, these signs shall follow them that believe. And he talks about the miracles. And then Mark closes with the statement that they went everywhere preaching the word, the Lord working with them by confirming the word with the accompanying signs. So that's a pretty clear statement. And then the writer of Hebrews made the same or similar statement in Hebrews chapter 2, in verse 1, where he talks about how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which at the first was spoken to us by the Lord, and later confirmed unto us by those that heard him. Again, and the Lord working with them with miracles and wonders and signs. Miracles and wonders and signs. And by the way, Peter even pointed to the miracles of Jesus on the day of Pentecost. Jesus of Nazareth, a man, now when it says, as we read it, we read it in our King James, a man approved among you by God. But what it means is that God gave testimony to him. That God testified that he was the Son of God. Jesus asked us, what miracle are you stoning me for? Why are you doing this? What is the miracle that I've done that causes you to want to stone me? Well, we're stoning you because you claim to be the Son of God. It's like, did you not see the miracles? Does everybody just walk around and do what I do? Don't be so blind. And so the miracles were given to confirm, and by this goes the Old Testament too. Elijah, Moses, Lord, what do I say? Who shall I say sent me? And what if they don't believe? So God gave his messengers the miraculous to confirm the word. And then secondly, after the church was established, the miracles were given to confirm and build up the church, to give the church the equipment, the tools that they needed to go and do the work they'd been commissioned to do until the Bible could be written. Those early Christians didn't have Bibles. They didn't have the New Testament. None of it had been written. You're talking about 10 or 15 years before the first New Testament book was ever written after the establishment of the church. And so the early church received the miraculous gifts from the apostles so that they could carry out their work again and show their friends and neighbors that that the message that they were presenting to them and their message about Jesus was legitimate and true and needed to be believed and obeyed. And so those are the two primary purposes of miracles. And so those are not, I should say, that is not what we are seeing today being practiced by those who purport to perform miracles. All right, I want to stop right there for right now, and Lord willing, I'll come back to this in our next session. I've got some more things I want to talk about. Let me make a mark here. Today is the 12th, and I'll hold this mark here. All right, any questions or comments about anything that we've worked through tonight? No? Just to make sure, is there anybody here that did not have opportunity to take the Lord's Supper this morning? I didn't think so, but I wanted to ask and make sure. All right, I'm going to turn this on. And